Hey there, Art of Theater folk. Today I'm going to chat with you about African American theater, at least in the introduction to the world of African American theater as we kind of move into our multicultural theater experience. So, again, like so many of the subjects we're touching on, you could study this for, well, a lifetime and or like a full course. So, this is just sort of a sense of sort of African theater history. So you'll see there's just a few different images from different time periods. Just to preface the next few lectures, lessons, PowerPoints, because American history is so intense, there's definitely some things that'll come up in these PowerPoints that speak to that. One of the first slides in the PowerPoint is talking about minstrel shows, where white people were putting on blackface, and there was a lot of entertainment shows, and it sort of came out of the vaudeville world. So there's definitely some uncomfortable history, but we have to acknowledge it. Um, and yeah, just to sort of as like a trigger warning, there might be a few um, slides or terms where you're like, oh, the history. So yeah, so just acknowledging that these are the roots. So yeah, and again, we have sort of that first slide, which speaks to minstrel shows, and so much of this early theater that was happening kind of in that early 1900s vaudeville time was highly influenced by white people and their interpretations or their telling of sort of black stories, which is why they're so often offensive and skewed. But something that's really cool is that in the 1800s, so before vaudeville and all of that was going on, in the 1800s in New York, there was a really great company called the African Company, who were all about putting on the Shakespeare. So yeah, 1800s New York. This one company who had a headquarters in this guy's apartment kind of started this Shakespeare group. It caused a lot of strife and conflict, and eventually the police came and arrested some of the company members for performing without a license. Um, yeah, so it's amazing how early on in theater folks were getting arrested for their art. So, but yeah, really cool early company to note, the African Company. And then we sort of speak to ragtime and how uh, the ragtime music sort of was a bridge into sort of the musical theater world coming out of vaudeville. Um, yes, and you'll read one of the first full length musical comedies written by African Americans was a show called A Trip to Coontown. Um, yes, quite the title, but it was performed as sort of like a vaudeville act, but it was again maybe for the first time written by people of color. So small victories. Um, then again, we sort of talk more about musical theater. There was this movement called the Harlem Renaissance in the sort of early 20s. So after World War I, the sort of Harlem Renaissance came, which was really a growth of musical theater. And among that was a piece called Shuffle Along, which was another African American written and performed musical theater piece. It was sort of like the full team was made up of African American folk. And there's a clip you can watch that shows a recent revival of that piece and why it's so important for the history. Someone who got their start in this show, she replaced one of the other actresses, but her name was Florence Mills, and she was known as the Queen of Happiness in the 1920s, and she was sort of the first female African American Broadway star, Florence Mills. So she's a good one to know. At this time, in this Harlem Renaissance time after World War I, some of early like African American playwright development was going on. So there was almost like these literary contests of who could write like the best plays. Some of the playwrights who came out of this were Eulalie Spencer, Georgia Douglas Johnson, um, yeah, and I'm sure a sprinkling of others. So this time is important because it's again the community writing their own stories with their own voices, as opposed to somebody else imposing that. Um, right. So by the end of the 1920s, there were about like 20 plays and musicals with African American themes that had been presented on Broadway. Five of those were written by African Americans. Um, During the Depression, however, everything was kind of going to hell for theater, especially commercial theater, so like musical theater. Um, but what was really great was the country, America stepped up and created this thing called the Federal Theater Project, which was supposed to help artists during the Depression. And it formed sort of separate, like black units in about 22 cities. And the teams were sort of made up of African American writers, technicians, and this Federal Theater Project was largely responsible for kind of creating the next wave of Black theater artists because it was sort of they gave grant money out. One of the most famous productions was of all African American Macbeth by Shakespeare. Yeah. Then we're like hopping into the 50s. You'll see an image of Lorraine Hansberry, who's our playwright for A Raisin in the Sun, which you guys will read or will have read perhaps by the time you've watched this lecture. Raisin in the Sun was first produced in 1959, and you'll see what it's about, a black family in Chicago who's living their lives and trying to move into a predominantly white neighborhood and how that goes down. There's a little clip that's really cool. It shows one of the scenes from the play with three different actresses as Mama. And so, yeah, you can check that out. The person who directed it is a man named Lloyd Richards. So, A Raisin in the Sun was produced on Broadway, and he directed it, and went on to also direct a lot of August Wilson's plays. So, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. He won a Tony Award for his direction of the play Fences, which is one of August Wilson's most popular shows. But yeah, he was the one who directed Raisin in the Sun, Lloyd Richards. Then we've got another video clip from Raisin in the Sun, just looking at sort of the three different women and the three different generations that we see in this story, from Mama Ruth and then Beneatha. And the play really gives us a sense of kind of what was going on culturally in America at the time, pre-civil rights. Then we have some more sort of activist folks. So there's this really strong presence. Amiri Baraka was a playwright who wrote a play called Slave and also The Dutchman. What else to say about this? Yeah, The Dutchman is based in a New York subway car and sort of a interaction that goes awry. Amiri Baraka did most of his work in Harlem and founded the Black Arts Repertory Theater School in Harlem in the mid-60s. So yeah, when you think of sort of Amiri Baraka, you can think of more of like a strong activist voice coming out in the plays. Like they're not, entertainment. They're not shuffle along. They're a little more pointed and really shining a light on a lot of the crazy cultural imbalances of the time. Mm-hmm. And then sort of still in the 60s and 70s, we've got a few female Black playwrights that are featured. So we have a woman named Adrienne Kennedy. What was cool about her work is it's a little bit less in the world of realism. So it's a bit more poetic, using metaphor, symbolism. It's less linear, like a straight up story. And it explores a lot of dynamics of just Black and white identities. Also in the same slide, we have Ntozake Shange, who also was, I think, raised in, well, Jersey, and but her work was produced in New York in the 70s, and one of her most famous pieces is for colored girls who have considered suicide slash When the Rainbow is Enough, which is again kind of like Adrienne Kennedy style, which is a bit less realistic, more surreal in that it's not a straight up story. It's like sketches, songs, monologues, like little pieces that are all formed together. And there's then a clip from a Toronto production that I saw, directed by a really famous Canadian woman named Janet Sears. And you can kind of get a sense of what this choreo poem is, what this less linear storytelling is like in that piece. Yeah. And then hopping into the 80s and 90s, what is sort of highlighted here, again, we're skipping so many things, but there was a Tony Award winning piece called Bringin' de Noise, Bringin' de Funk, that was sort of like a tap-based musical. So there was this guy named Savion Glover, who's a renowned tap dancer, and this piece is sort of based on, you know, the magic of tap, and yeah, won a ton of awards. You can see a clip of him tapping away, and just like a vibe of what that show was. Yeah. And then we kind of just reiterate the importance of August Wilson, and as one of like the most important American playwrights of the 20th century. He, of course, had written that 10-cycle play that were written, I should know this, in the 60s or 70s, but they each play is set in a different decade. So, you know, 1900s, 1910, 1920, each play is kind of set in a different decade to highlight what was going on for folks. One of his pieces is 7 Guitars, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, written in the 80s, so that this is making sense. I'm sure that he wrote most of his work from like the 70s to the 90s, is my sense. I can find that out. The Piano Lesson is another beautiful play. Oh, and then where did that go? I'm looking at the PowerPoint. I might have to reinstate it, but there's a beautiful clip from Fences that has Viola Davis. I'm going to make sure that's in your PowerPoint. It's worth seeing. Great. So moving in a little bit more contemporary, kind of late 90s into the early 2000s, is a few more female playwrights. One is Suzanne Laurie Parks. She had written a piece called Top Dog, Underdog that was off-Broadway and starred Don Cheadle and Jeffrey Wright, who are both incredible actors, and won the Pulitzer Prize for drama. Yeah, Suzanne Laurie Parks. And we also have Lynn Nottage, who's written so many amazing, really current, relevant pieces. Intimate Apparel. Sweat is one that was just happening at the Cleveland Playhouse. Ruined. Crumbs from the Table of Joy. She's written a lot of really contemporary, relevant work, and they're all actually quite different. So she's won also the Pulitzer Prize for drama, and there's an interview with her where you can check out what she's all about. Yeah. And then Danai Gurira, who you may recognize from Black Panther, but she's also a really incredible theater artist and playwright. So just worth knowing. You can read her play called The Convert, which is also badass. And the last few slides are just highlighting casting and how a lot of modern directors and companies are engaging in color conscious or colorblind casting. So there's an image of a Toronto production where there's an African American Mary Poppins, and it's often most companies try to work with the idea that if there's nothing in a script that specifically calls for a certain race or ethnicity, gender, most directors are trying to kind of balance out the historical scales and hire more, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. to kind of, yeah, make up for history. That was Siri. She thought I was talking to her. And then finally, there's just another image of a friend of mine, Darren Herbert, in Canada, who was cast as Harold Hill in The Music Man. So again, a role that's historically been played exclusively by white men, but for what reason? Just convention. So, so more and more prominent and more local indie companies are trying as much as possible to give people of color opportunities on stage, and then there's a lot of African American playwrights, thriving African American artistic directors, so that the whole theater company's operations are going to be run from a new perspective. So, yeah. African American theater introduction. Hope it was helpful. Let me know if you guys have any questions or stuff comes up as we kind of dive into the history of some of these peeps.